welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Good to have you along again with us, Mike and I, and we are going to handle questions again today. We have numerous questions coming into our mailbox at questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Feel free to send comments or questions, and we do appreciate them. As we jump in fact, let's just jump into our first question, Mike. Again, thank you for these kind of thoughtful ideas. I've wondered this one: can a loyalist simply be misled? And here's how the writer said it, or the question, the submitter said it. What should we think about Roman Catholics who venerate Mary and give her titles that should be reserved for Jesus? Now, if you're a Roman Catholic listening to this, I know you have an answer, but from a Protestant side of things, we hear words about Mary that make us uncomfortable, frankly. Okay, and the questioner continues: does God consider this idolatry, or can God simply see this as an example of a loyal, righteous person being unwittingly misled, or not thinking properly about, for example, Mary? And then the questioner got into the idea, and I'm going to paraphrase this. This re-asks the question of what it means to follow God, and when it comes to or being misled, possibly. And let's start with the question theologically: can a loyalist be misled? And let's start it with the question of how we think about God. And let me say it this way. I'll give you my answer, Mike, and see what you think. A clear biblical theme to appreciate, I think, and not just, when I say it, it's not just there. I think we need to appreciate this, is the distinction between having genuine loyalty to God and being able to articulate clear theology about God. I know I have been guilty of this. I believe I followed God early on in life, like I do now. I look back upon some of my own views, and I think I was dead wrong, just dead wrong. And I taught them from the classroom. I think I've told you this story, Mike, where someone asked a question and I answered it, and I felt so good about it. I went back to my office, and I was dead wrong. I looked it up, and I'll never forget that feeling of how could I be so sure of myself? And the audience, the Bible college classroom bought it. Of course, what do they have to compare it to? But then I look back upon it, and how could I feel so right and be so wrong? And I forget what it was, but it just struck me. And think of this: the distance between the disciples' loyalty for Jesus, or to Jesus, and their understanding of him is both shocking and, I think, predictive of how future followers of Jesus will struggle as well. Numerous times, the disciples will say, "No, Jesus, you're not going to die," or something along that line. They just don't get it, right? They'll hear a parable or something and not understand, or just be misled about how to think of Jesus. Jesus is gracious. I get the sense he says, you don't understand who I am. Only the Father knows me, Matthew 11. Because they probably showed their ignorance or theological lack of understanding all the time, right? So I think when we start this question, or start the answer to the question, can a loyalist be misled? I want to say very loudly, absolutely. And even that word misled, I don't want it to imply that, hey, I know what's right and they don't know what's right. I'm saying that we all struggle with being wrong. And so that going to heaven will not have a theological checklist that we have to, be correct about to get in. There has been a general question over time whether there is some kind of a triage of importance behind, is this important versus that? And, the timing of Jesus coming to earth, be it amill, pre-mill, post-mill, whatever, certainly that can't be on the checklist for getting into heaven, I would say. Those kinds of questions we all joke about being, why are we even arguing this when it probably doesn't matter to some degree. So far so good, Mike. Anything you want to say? I think theologically, I'm starting with that. Theologically, can we be misled and be loyalists? Absolutely. And My Roman Catholic friends who are believers, and I have some in my own family, as I like to say, I won't see them in heaven because they'll be too near the throne of God. I mean, they're just lovely, lovely Christian people who are taught to do this, and they don't know any other way to do it than this. And I have a friend who was at the bedside of a very ailing friend, and she mentioned her rosary, and she appreciated her rosary that she had with her, and something I've never done. Now, how should I look at that? I have no problem with it, because to her, it's a means of prayer. And if you were to say to her, how dare you, she would be confused by the question. So anyway, anything so far?
I mean, I think we often forget that even the apostles themselves were wrong at times, that some of them reverted back to affirming ideas that earlier, that, for example, like Peter, during the Jerusalem Council, he was very clear about...
Into the book of Acts, yeah.
Into the book of Acts, he was very clear. God makes no distinction between Jew and Gentile, that they should be welcomed in, that they don't have to proselytize, become Jewish first, and then they can become Christians. And yet later, we have Paul, who outrightly rebukes Peter because from pressure of certain groups within a church community, he decided, I'm going to sit with the Jewish Christian table instead of with the Gentile Christian table, just because of how it might look and people might be upset with me. And Paul just outrightly calls him out. Like, you were saying this during the council, which is great, but why are you also reverting back to this kind of favoritism type behavior? Yeah. And so, like, I think we forget that we can have some practices and beliefs that are not perfect. And that is actually kind of one of the beauties about following after Jesus, the following after the Creator ultimately, is there is this graciousness, that there is progress, that over time, this expectation, you will continue to grow as you continue to be humble about these mistakes, these missteps, these misgivings, these miscomprehensions at times. And I think sometimes, because you and I, Ron, are coming from like this Protestant kind of heritage as well, there is almost always this kind of background animosity that's assumed that has to be between us and Roman Catholics, or us versus Eastern Orthodox, or us and anyone who practices some sort of high liturgical church, right? We look at Anglicans with like a weary eye. And I think a lot of that just seems to be, we had gotten so used to a type of faith practice where we were mentally checking things off of like, how am I showing that I'm a better Christian than that other person? Like, did I get baptized as a baby, or did I get baptized as an adult? Did I say the Lord's Prayer from memory? Did I do this? Did I give to the poor? We have this mental checklist that we're doing because we're, in some sense, comparing ourselves with one another. And I don't know, I think just that has led at times to bickering, which is annoying. But at worst, like Matthew Bates's book that came out last year, it outrightly led to war at times.
Right. I was thinking, in fact, let me read my next slide here, because that brings up a thought that I was considering for this answer, talking about it here on the podcast, and then I decided not to. When it comes to learning theology, this is my personal opinion, Mike, to our audience. See what you think. Try to do it alongside, when you're going to learn theology, try to do it alongside someone who doesn't always come to the same conclusions you do. In other words, avoid the echo chamber. Avoid, now, practically speaking, what I'm getting at is avoid the Christian college classroom, where if, and this is where I taught 3 different colleges, the student had to sign a paper that they were a Christian before they could even be allowed in the classroom. That's a good thing, because now we have a basis, right, for our conversation. It can be a bad thing if it becomes an echo chamber, though, because now, without the non-believer in the room, we can talk about the non-believer and say things that he, if he were there, he'd put his hand up and say, that's not true. That is not true. I don't think that way. Or you're making a grand assumption. about me and my friends that otherwise, and so that to me was one of the dispelling frustrations for me in the Christian college classroom, was the echo chamber feel of not having anyone here to push back. And so that brings me to my next point that I have on the screen. Question poor reasoning. While you're learning your theology, question poor reasoning, even if it agrees with your conclusion. So, and I find this to be true too, that when we're talking as theologians together, or a group in our church or whatever, and we say, we, for whatever reason, we list 5 reasons why something is true. We need to be willing to call out the third reason if it's a bad reason, and say that's not really a good argument for our view. I know we use it, and it gets us back to the same conclusion, but what happens in that classroom often is that the bad arguments are allowed to stand because no one questions them, because they help the final conclusion. But I find numerous things now when I'm standing outside that classroom. I look back and I say, boy, what I said really wasn't a good argument, and yet we put it on our paper and used it for answers for the quiz. But I think we need to. What I'm doing is just saying, folks, learn your theology, but do it well, even if you get in trouble when you provoke your friends or your teachers by putting up your hand and saying, "Oh, that's not really a good argument." If we use that, our debater is going to call us out on that, even though they're not here in the room. Lastly, and I find this more and more helpful, map out intramural debates in theology and biblical studies while processing your own views. In other words, be thinking about the options all the time, mapping out, who believes what, maybe not by name, but certainly by views, and then ask why more often than what. Ask, why does a person believe that? Mm-hmm. And one more thing, Mike, and then I want obviously give me your thoughts. Here is where I'd recommend, if you have the time and opportunity and the money, invest in, and it's not hard to find them now with Amazon, delivery, the next day delivery. I'm amazed how fast you can get books. Be looking for books. This is the Zondervan series. I think it's called Counterpoint, where they have 4 views on, 5 views on, 4 views of this, 5 views of that, whatever. And what I'm showing on the screen, 4 views of creation, 5 views on biblical inerrancy, 4 views on heaven, 5 views on the gospel, 4 views on hell. The idea that, and this comes as a surprise to many people, including people in our own Divine Council Worldview camaraderie, whatever group you find yourself in that likes to think about DCW things, I think you'd be amazed if you polled the audience, even in those groups, how different we are when it comes to our understanding of hell, our understanding of heaven, biblical inerrancy. I mean, those kind of things. Mike and I, Dr. Mike, in our personal conversations over the years, because we taught together, we went to school together, we philosophized together on a lot of things. And that's the beauty of that friendship for me, was I could say anything I wanted and he wouldn't look at me askance, and he could say anything he wanted and I would never doubt his intention, right? So that we would often wonder how far for example, could we go with the doctrine of inerrancy? Where were the boundaries that we had to stop? Not that we were trying to push the boundaries, but we knew that echo chamber was dangerous. We both knew it. And so we would often talk outside the classroom about the classroom that we just experienced, that we were teaching, right? And how it felt dangerous to be the teacher in a room where no one was pushing back. We just knew it was dangerous. And so anyway, that's what I mean by mapping out the options. Be reading other people's views all the time. And that's why when someone says, what's a good book on blank? I don't want to say a book, because I don't want you to think that's the only book you need to read. You need to read all the books on heaven or biblical inerrancy or creation or the gospel. And I know that sounds hard to do and impossible, but don't consider yourself, or I can't consider myself, a theologian if I read one view. It's just impossible to do it that way. So Anyway, this is all coming out of this question: can a loyalist be misled? Sure. And we are all on this trail of figuring out our theology, and it's a fun journey. I think you know that, Mike. You speak of it that way. I certainly do. But let's not make it a simple journey. Let's enjoy the challenge. So I've said a lot again, so go ahead and jump in.
Well, I think as like, and even if, for example, right, if a person doesn't want to check out this series, and actually this does look like a pretty good series. I was actually kind of amused and chuckling to myself when I saw the names for the biblical inerrancy, because I know most of those names, and I know they land on very different spots.
Very different spots, yeah.
But one of the things that I had learned over my time at Gordon, it was, until I started going through those courses, I never realized how important it was, not just only to learn the theological statements, the theology, but also how the history also has to be paired at the same time. You can't just do history and then forget everything after you're done with that class and then take theology. Like, you actually, ideally, I realized, and it kind of happened with me, I was doing a theology class and a history class at the same time. And so we were almost kind of overlapping on topics. And I realized as that was happening, I was seeing things from the history class in Christian history with the Christian theology. They intersected, and you realize the local moment for a lot of the theology was also affected by real historical events and influences that were going on around the Christians, around those inside the empire of Rome, for example, or even how things in the Persian Empire was influencing things that were going on within Rome. And so you realize that in some sense they were responding to their current day and moment of what felt pressing for them. And for myself, even for us as modern 21st century Christians here in the US, my experience of Christianity is probably very vastly different from those from maybe in the suburbs of Georgia or from like the city center of Dallas. Like, the way that I experience my evangelicalism here, like, there's constant pressures from both the politics, but also from many other, churches, denominations, certain groups that people might say are cults, like that. You have these things that are going on. And so for us, we feel a need of how to contextualize our theological statements in ways that make sense to our people that may not make sense to someone that lives down in Los Angeles, right? Like we were talking about last episode, my church makes a big deal about saying things such as Jesus is king. Because here in the Northeast, especially in a very blue state as Massachusetts, a certain party is king. A certain ideology is king. A certain thing is supposed to be what you give your all for in this region. And for us to make the statement, no, it's actually not that. You can't give yourself to an ideology. You can't give yourself to a political party. You can't give yourself to what are X, Y, and Z. The only one who deserves everything of your all in all is Jesus. And we make that such a point because we feel the need to have to be able to communicate that in a way that is poignant and like it strikes people. And so I think, when folks look at things such as like, why do Roman Catholics venerate Mary? And we don't need to get into the ins and outs of that. But one thing that helped me appreciate this was to study also the history at the same time of why did this develop? What was the impulse that was happening with ancient Christians around the 3rd and 4th century that moved them towards this idea of venerating Mary? Why was her virgin status, for example, elevated? What was going on in the minds of the Christians of that time? Why did they feel a need to go that way? A few weeks ago, I even explained a little bit of this with two of the folks in my church after service, and just how we as modern Christians don't understand how for the first 2-3 centuries of Christianity, every catechumen, basically baptismal candidate, had to basically be ready for the possibility, I may die for this. Yeah. I may actually be called out by someone. I may lose not only my well-being, my financial property, my family, but I actually might lose my life. Am I willing to lay my life down for this king? And then after a certain point, Christianity was no longer persecuted. But you then had essentially 2-3 centuries worth of this kind of training that so many of the Christians had, and then are just now wondering, well, now I won't be persecuted. I won't die for the faith. I was looking forward to some sense of this. This is what I was preparing myself for. Was it a waste? And once you start feeling like, well, how would I feel with that kind of training and pressure? And then you start seeing how the early church fathers talked about things such as celibacy, chastity. Then you start seeing dots and make connections. I think when you can understand why the theology developed and what was going on at the time, it rounds off the edge. It doesn't mean that you can't disagree.
Yeah.
But it does actually help you become more empathetic and understanding of why the theology developed the way it did. And
I saw a friend cross themselves when we had lunch once, and instead of just crossing himself, he pressed very hard into his chest and into his arms very slowly. And I couldn't help but ask why. Why do you push so hard to the point of pain? And he said, because that's the way I've been taught by my spiritual advisor, and happened to be Greek Orthodox Church, and that God, to be reminded of suffering as part of the gospel. And he went on into this story. It struck me that, again, different opinion and different tradition, but it comes from a certain vantage point of history, where the church father that he read and enjoyed thought that was important. So, godly man, I don't do that, but godly man. And I wouldn't use the word misled there even, because maybe he's right, maybe I'm wrong. But differences of opinion, absolutely. So, well, thank you, Mike. We are glad to have a sponsor for this episode, and it's brought to us by certified financial planner Josh Taylor. And Mike, go ahead and tell us about our sponsor today.
Well, Josh Taylor is with the Kompass Financial Advisors, and he is an independent Christian certified financial planner. And he's here to help you design a custom plan to achieve your investment planning goals. He offers advice on IRAs, 401k rollovers, pension benefits, and more. He can also answer your questions about integrating annuities to your plan. With over 30 years of professional investment experience, Josh will provide a unique perspective to your personal goals. For more information, please go ahead and contact Josh Taylor at www.compassfinancial.com. Remember, that is Compass with a K.
Thank you, Josh, for being willing to give us help here on this podcast. We do greatly appreciate it. Here's the next question we have. How does petitionary prayer work? Glad it's being asked. Here's how they asked it. Why does Jesus ask or say, "Ask and it shall be given"? Is this specifically for his disciples or for us believers? And how do we deal with prayers which are not answered? Is there any reason, this questioner ends his question with this, is there any reason God would keep a person in a situation that is sin when they have asked to be freed from it? When it comes to the specifics of this question, and let me even make the question more difficult than maybe it was presented here. The challenge of Matthew is at 7, where he says, say to this mountain, move, and it will move. If we want to say that's symbolic, yes, I mean, that's easy to do. The problem is he presses the literalness of it, even when we want him to become symbolic, right? So this is a hard question. It's even harder than we may sometimes understand. Is it specifically for his disciples or for us believers? Remember that in that world, gods were being appealed to all the time by pagans. I'm listening to Seneca on my Audible account, and he wrote as a Roman philosopher. He's a Stoic, and he's around. He's contemporary with Jesus and Paul for a century, and he says several times as I'm listening to him, the problem with the gods is, and I'm paraphrasing, they really don't care about us, and if they give us answers to our prayers, don't presume it's the best thing for you. Be careful with their answers. Be disciplined in how you approach life. Ask the gods for things, of course. Again, I'm really paraphrasing here. He says it very well, a very interesting reading. But basically what he's saying is don't ask the gods for help because they really don't care how you're doing. So maybe, I'm just going to throw this out before I even give my answer. Jesus, remember that last time we had a question about the polemic behind Jesus' loyalty? There may be a polemic in the prayer discussions that Jesus has because everyone else is praying to their gods too. So when Jesus says, ask and it will be given, the polemical side of that may be ask to a God who knows how to answer better than any other God. It's like in my line of business where I work at a bank, my 8-hour-a-day job, we have people that I know answer emails better than others. And Sally will answer her emails within half an hour. Bill, forget it. You might as well send the email and wait a month. That's in other words, when you talk about ask and it shall be given, in that sense, you're talking about people who answer emails all day long. But this person, Sally, she's really good at it, and maybe that's what Jesus is hinting at in how he says this to a crowd, that you're talking about a prayer life that's going to be much more covenantal, with answers coming because A, that God loves you, B, because that God's interested in you, and he's fast, he's quicker, those kind of things. So let me give you some thoughts here on this good question. I'm going to start with C.S. Lewis because my favorite non-biblical author, he talks about prayer a lot, and depending on the essay you read. Let me say this, summarizing them. He found the concept of petitionary prayer to be one of the greatest intellectual difficulties of the Christian faith. He admitted that there is probably not a more difficult question in his mind than petitionary prayer. So I hope that makes us all say thanks a lot. In other words, we're in for a big one here when you ask, how does it work? He wrestled with such questions as, if a sovereign God already knows what's best, why ask? Why are some of God's greatest blessings not asked for? You get a wonderful blessing from the Lord and you realize you never prayed for that. It just came. Well, what does that teach you? Third, if his will is settled, how can our prayers make any difference? If they do make a difference, think about this. Does that mean reality would have been worse without our asking? Are we to blame for asking and getting an answer that turns out to be maybe not good for my neighbor? God give me this job and he doesn't get it because I got it. Those kind of questions. And let's just go straight to Lewis's general conclusions because I find them helpful. And Mike, let's see what you think. Scripture commands and models petitionary prayer. It just says do it. Mm-hmm. Ask, seek, and knock. Pray without ceasing. Those kind of statements are obviously New Testament statements, but they reflect Old Testament thinking as well. So the practice cannot be just naive. We're not doing nothing, right? In fact, imagine the opposite. If Jesus had said, there's no need to pray, God knows what he's doing, imagine how that would have affected our Christian life. But we have just the opposite. We have a Jesus who just says it, pray all the time, as though, and he uses several parables of people banging at the door throughout the night, and the guy doesn't even want to get out of bed. Interesting way of picturing the Father. Secondly, Lewis recommended this. God has chosen to work through real secondary causes, and human prayer is one of those causes. So, as it were, join the party. Just get involved in praying because that may be, in Lewis's mind, and I like this, I think it's common sense, My prayer is the way God uses secondary causation. And I'm just part of a long litany of prayers, millions, billions of people praying for something, and God is answering that prayer or my prayers with everyone else's prayers as a part of secondary causation in how he runs the world. Lastly, as far as Lewis, prayer does not change God's mind. In his mind, Lewis was not Greg Boyd in that sense. You don't change his mind. But and maybe this is splitting hairs, it's part of the means by which he eternally wills things to happen. In other words, he sees your prayer as much as he sees his answer to your prayer as eternally past. Or, I'm sorry, eternally present. And so you're praying for your friend to be safe when you heard that an airplane had crashed, and you pray that he wasn't on the plane, but then you realize, well, that prayer should have been said 5 hours ago when he got on the plane. God's answer back is, well, I'm hearing your prayer, I'm seeing the accident, I'm watching him get on the plane, all of those things at the same time in the eternal presence. So that gets into philosophy, obviously. But that's one of the ways around that problem. Any thoughts so far? I'm going to close this question with that interesting thought: why would God allow me to continue to suffer with something that I'm praying about? So,
well, like recently, we closed out a series where we were talking about what does it mean to practice the way of Jesus, and so we got into conversations about what is prayer, what is solitude, that kind of thing, and I did a talk about solitude. And one of the interesting things as I reviewed, like you always can just keep finding things back in the Sermon on the Mount over and over again. It is an endless well. And one of those interesting bits to me is like, I get why we say petitionary prayer. We give it a category and whatever else. But at the end of the day, the reason why we pray, whether it's for petitionary or intercession or whatever else, it's in the end supposed to be about communion with our Father, right? Of actually being in relationship and in conversation, in communion with our Heavenly Father. And that is actually what Jesus ultimately was trying to invite all of his disciples into, that kind of life. And that's why in the Sermon on the Mount and prayer, he specifically said things, don't babble like how the Gentiles, the pagans do when they pray, because they think that with their many words that somehow God will hear them. Like, don't just talk endlessly thinking you have to fill the silence with your air, thinking somehow that could, cause the God or the Father to give you what you want. Ultimately, what needs to happen in that time of prayer is to find yourself aligning your heart and your will with your Heavenly Father. And at the end of my talk, I actually realized during my study that Jesus's own time of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane was actually his own version of the Lord's Prayer. And there are clear echoes, especially in the Greek, in Matthew's Gospel, that you can see there's even one point where it's word for word, let your will be done, where it's an echo from the Lord's Prayer. He is addressing my Father instead of our Father. And he even goes to the disciples at one moment saying, you need to be praying so you don't give into temptation. He doesn't say anything about temptation, but it's the same word that appears. It's such this interesting moment of like he himself, in that time of being in that garden, he is asking, can I please not drink this cup? He's petitioning his Father that I don't want to drink this cup. I don't want to die. I don't want to go through this. And yet submits in the end, but let your will be done. Your will be done. Your will be done. And he does that 3 times. And something about at the end of that whole entire ordeal of prayer, of wrestling and talking with his Father, asking, please don't let me die, but understanding, okay, well, I'm not hearing an answer that says, sure, I'll withdraw the cup. Instead, I will submit to it. And it's such a contrast when you read that episode at the latter part of Matthew of how Jesus is just distressed. He's filled with sorrow. He is so worried and troubled, filled with anxiety. He asks Peter, James, and John, please pray with me. And he instead finds them all falling asleep. And at the end of his final prayer, he gets up and he is ready to meet the betrayer. It's like, rise, get up. Our betrayer is right here. He is like ready to go. And he has this resolution at the end of his time in prayer. And so I get why folks want to, they struggle with it. But I think at the end of the day, part of what prayer is supposed to, what it does ultimately is it brings us into the presence of our Father. And that presence is actually what is the reward that we're supposed to ultimately gain from it. Not necessarily answers to, can I get an A on my test, or can I please get this loan or whatever else? Those are nice because our Father is helpful and he wants to give good gifts to his children. But in the end, it's about that time that is spent with him. So I don't know if that provides a different kind of spin or perspective.
I like that about the covenant side. Yeah. I mean, your prayers, and I know my prayers can be very emotionally, what's the word? Spontaneous. And it doesn't, I've never liked praying in public because I want to say before I pray, if you really wanted to hear what I'm thinking, you don't want to hear what I'm thinking. My prayers in public are going to be said with you hearing me. But when I talk to God outside of your hearing, it doesn't sound anything like what you're about to hear. So I once said that as a pastor, and my people were kind of shocked, but I had to be honest. So.
And I think, Ron, there is something to be said that, like, why does he even want us to say the things that we need if he already knows, right? And I've realized over time, as I've gotten older, I don't know at times what I actually want or need until I change my mind so often.
He must be frustrated with how often I change my mind about what I want. So
it's just this interesting thing. It's when I finally verbalize something, then I realize, oh, that's actually what I've been thinking and wanting, but I didn't know how to put it into words. And now I actually have a concreteness to the idea. Yeah. I think there is something to it there's this interesting grace that, I know what you need, but are you sure you really know what you need?
Yeah, that kind of gets into my last thought. And this was an interesting way that the questioner ended their question, if you remember, regarding asking God to help us overcome sin. Why would God allow me or us, anyone, to battle a certain sin, even though I've prayed hard against it? Here's just my thought. This is my, I wouldn't even say it's my mature answer, but I've been around enough to watch this in my own life. So let me give you a recommendation regarding asking God to help us overcome sin. We can assume there may be no better prayer. Oh God, please help me, right? There may be no better prayer than that. Why? We are half-hearted creatures, often, to quote C.S. Lewis again, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. We are very weak people, and atheists know that. Christians know that. We all agree on our anthropology on that level. We are weak people. So we need God's help. However, and let me recommend this in closing, and let me give you the illustration first. I was in college teaching, and one of my students came in. I really enjoyed him. We got along well. We talked a lot. He was the captain of the soccer team, and a handsome guy, good-looking guy. I mean, he was, that was his struggle. He was popular, and he had a girlfriend. His in-laws to-be, they weren't engaged yet. When he would go over to the house, they wanted him to marry their daughter. And so they would, good night, and they'd wave, and they'd head upstairs. And here was his point, and he was very honest with me. We really struggle to not get too physically involved when we're alone. And in fact, last night he said, and he was bummed. He said, it was 11 o'clock, and we had a test tomorrow, and So I prayed. I said, Lord, help us concentrate on on our studying. And I stopped him right there. I said, there's your problem. That's not the prayer you pray. You pray, God, help me get out of the house. Just leave,
Mm.
In other words, I'm talking to a 22-year-old, and thank you for your honesty, but wrong prayer. So here's my recommendation to a very well said problem. Why would God allow me to continue to battle sin? Predict that God's answer to this sort of prayer, oh God, help me, will come by means of providential opportunities to discipline ourselves toward right thought and action instead of waiting for a miracle to occur. Don't say, oh God, help me not to, and then find yourself right there in the middle of the situation when you could have gotten up and walked away. Maybe that's the answer to your prayer. And I'm getting this from Lewis too. I mean, he was very honest about his prayer life as well. God wants us to mature more than get answers by miracle to our prayers. So, putting all that together, and I'm talking to myself here, Mike, when I pray for God to help me overcome something, I hear him say in very loving terms, well, good prayer, but I want you to mature so that you don't need a miracle to get an answer to your prayer. All right? So what do you need to do, Ron, to solve this? Without my help, miraculously, I'm not going to help you that way. How can you, with wisdom, work on this? So I'm not blaming the person by saying you're praying the wrong prayer. I'm saying that when someone says, why would God allow us to be, struggling with the sin that we're praying hard for, at least consider that the kind of prayer God wants you to ask might sound very different than just the, oh God, help me. It might be, God, give me the wisdom to never be in the position to, whatever it is, and find wisdom to get to that point. And that's a mature prayer, because now you're going to get into, secondary, tertiary causes of things. And it's going to drive your maturity level up quicker than your observance of a miracle. So, last thought.
I keep thinking of this thought. Many years ago, I heard this one Bible teacher said it this way to a similar question. And the response was that God generally will show one of these two things. He'll either show his sovereignty, or he'll show his sufficiency. And the teacher speaking at that moment said, knew of a person who was both a heavy drinker, heavy smoker, and became a Christian, wanted to stop those two habits. Dropped the smoking. That was cold turkey. That was some reason easy. That felt like a miracle. All of a sudden, did not feel the need to light up anymore. But with the drinking, that was something of, I need God to help me with this.
Sure.
And it's interesting is that both display things about God providing. In one instance, he provided his sovereignty. I can instantly free you from that particular addiction. But I also will demonstrate my sufficiency, that I will help and walk with you with the other.
Yeah.
And, I think, the question, sometimes when we answer these questions, we also presume that it's all on the individual and God. And I would also encourage for whoever asked this question, you're not alone as well. Right. You're part of the body. And, just so poignantly, as I was reminded this past Sunday from our executive pastor, when one part of the body hurts, the rest of the body hurts with it. And when that part is hurt, the other members of the body are meant to protect, cover, heal, help that other member. If we as Christians, oftentimes when we ask for things that we struggle with, whatever the addiction or whatever the compulsive behavior it is, we often don't reach out to others in the community of faith. And I know that's a scary thing for some folks.
Mm-hmm.
I know it is for me. I think we grew up in such a culture where it's supposed to be individual, Lone Ranger Christian life. And I'm constantly reminded of the importance of the community of the body of Christ. And of that assistance, that is another version of the providential opportunity to not only be assisted, but that your openness of the struggle assists and helps others who were afraid as well to share. And I mean, as Jesus said it, love one another as I have loved you. By this way, the world will know that you are my disciples.
Yeah.
How can we show our love to one another if we don't know how each other is hurting and how each other are needing one another's help?
Yeah. Well said. All right. Well, thank you. That's, it's a, talk about a rare thing, and that's a friend who can be that sounding board that you can knock on their door and say, I need you,
Yeah.
Let's talk. Thank you, everyone. Again, questions.dcwp@gmail.com for your comments or questions, and we'd love to have them. So thank you, Mike, and let's call it there for this edition. Until next time, then, everyone, pray without ceasing. And thank you for these thoughts, believing that your God is excited to both listen and act on your behalf. Thank you, everyone.